Welcome to all. This is Shad from the South Side, and this is the new first episode of the books. The show's hopeful premise is to give a clear and unfiltered perspective of sports from a Chicago's point of view. I've spoken through a lot of national and local areas, but the books is going to be provocative as fuck. To me, professional off seasons have structure and what you should be keeping in mind. Information, data you get on a daily matters, establishing your point of view and the perspective of your favorite team and football player. But in this case, we're going to be opening up with the logic for the Chicago Bears 2026 NFL Combine and pre-free agency operations. We're going to touch on 5 major points to kind of give you an unsolicited point of view from our perspective on what we should be paying attention to if you're a Bears fan or avid follower. First things first, some key dates to notice in terms of the NFL offseason. This is also going to coincide with the days that you'll get content released from us in terms of on the daily. You can see us on CNG Podcasts, on YouTube or on TikTok. You can also find content from me as well on the podcast, as well on TikTok and YouTube. But on February 17th, teams can tag their own players. Internal conversations from organizations after they've made decisions internally on how to promote or guys that's going to move around for the Chicago Bears. Ian Cunningham, who's the assistant general manager, is no longer here, went to Atlanta. We still haven't got those 3 comp picks, but Ryan Poles is still in the building. Bears haven't tagged anybody of significance so far through the offseason. As of February 23rd through the 2nd last week, the NFL Scouting Combine took over the media and the news. Pretty much a lot of the players that qualified for the draft came out of Indianapolis and put on a performance. It was pretty much a bittersweet situation. We're going to discuss that in a few moments in terms of some of the main points from the Combine relates to the Bears. But on the 3rd, yesterday, you have the deadline to tag your own players. A lot of the bigger names or the tier 2, 3 guys that weren't able to negotiate long-term contracts were either signed and tagged to a modest deal based on their players' positional standing as well as their tier status in the league. Open it up for today's conversation for the Chicago Bears. And a couple things we're going to get to. And the first one is, who is we keeping? The cuts, the tags, the trades. These are the conversations for people in terms of what the roster actually looks about. So let's take a look. First things first, when you're looking at the quarterback position, it's pretty obvious. You know, Caleb Williams is your announced quarterback moving forward until things have changed, until some emerging problem comes to the franchise. But as of right now, you're locked and loaded at quarterback. And over the last decade, the Chicago Bears have not had that luxury of being able to go into an off season, specifically into a free agency setting, as well as an off season for the draft, knowing your quarterback long term is locked and loaded. A lot of talk about Tyson Bagent being able to garner some draft capital. I think it's a little bit suspect, but if there was some interest, you could see a situation where the Bears would use an asset right there as a backup that could be a legitimate reason to keeping the guy. But if you can get that asset in the draft, specifically this draft, based on the things that have gone on in the last couple of weeks, it wouldn't be crazy. The running back room with Roschon Johnson, Kyle Monangai, DeAndre Swift to start the season off looks to be pretty much legit. But the standpoint is a lot of players and a lot of fans have been discussing, can you upgrade this position? This is a really good draft for running backs. You had guys running 4.4s. I like the kid out of Arkansas, Washington. And we always know that the best player in this draft, in my opinion, is Jeremiah Love. And Jeremiah Love could go in the top 10, and I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever. I don't necessarily look at the Bears being aggressive enough to go up there and pull a move to get Jeremiah, even though that would be an elite all-pro move for Ryan Poles if he chose to use his assets to do that and really fortify your offense moving forward, put in a legitimate start, running back spot, and giving yourself what Detroit had with a Gibbs, and really transform this this entire organization in terms of looking at it from a defensive standpoint into now having a complete, absolute dynamo on offense. If you want to mimic the Chiefs, you got to go get the pieces. Looking at the O-line, we're going to discuss a couple of components. It's more major components, but it's specifically just overall. Amagaji and Bates necessarily weren't even relative this year, but the Bears did bolster the top 5 O-line, 2 Pro Bowlers. When you look at Jonah Jackson, Joe Tooney, Drew Darman. All-Pro and 2 All-Pros, one All-Pro and 2 Pro Bowlers, meaning that you had a legitimate offseason to sign and identifying guys that was going to help your team. Darnell Wright played the part at the right tackle spot, so you think you got 4 spots that are locked and loaded. And you just got to address left tackle in the offseason because Braxton Jones didn't necessarily progress to the point where you feel like you want to invest long term. Theo Benedict showed to be a good substitute teacher. Outside of that, Ozzie Trapillo with a cracked leg. Not really nothing to look at left tackle long term right now that you can book in for the Chicago Bears. So that was definitely a position in need going into the offseason. But now, with a couple other things going on that we'll address in a minute, the offensive line that went from being top 5 in the league last year may go through some changes going into the next season. I don't know how much of an impact that's going to be in terms of the play calling with Ben Johnson or the development with Caleb Williams, but you're going from a strength to now taking a little bit off of that. So let's go see how that's going to impact the entire overall team and roster. Next point for me, defensive line and linebackers, front 7, Chicago Bears, main component for me for the whole offseason to justify if this is going to be a real team moving forward or not. I expect out of these positions here in the front 7, 5 new starters. Quite frankly, Austin Booker and Javon Dexter were 2 guys that were at least serviceable as players last year in the rotation. Grady Jarrett underperformed his contract. Got absolutely nothing from Hardy and Billings as far as I'm concerned. Dangbo was just a waste of money last year, even though he tore his ACL early in the season. He just didn't seem like a guy that was a great fit, and he didn't pop off the film early in the year, especially looking in the preseason. Montez Sweat is a professional. He's an overpaid professional, but he needs some help on that D-line, and I'm tired of saying it. Shamar Turner also got hurt, who was an early draft pick invested into Ryan Poles, and Chris Williams was just a basic average guy on the defensive line. So your front was pretty average, and the numbers best that out. Definitely a point of reference if you got just looking at the guys that's under contract. If you take away Billings, you take away Chris Williams, and you take away Hardy, at the very least you should see the Bears invest somewhere with some great resource to add 3 defensive linemen, whether they're defensive ends or defensive tackles based on best suited scheme for Dennis Allen. You got to see 3 defensive tackles added to this unit. Linebacker with Tremaine Edmonds on the block, TJ Edwards coming off multiple injuries, and not necessarily a really great season from either Hippolyte Jones or Sewell. And not mention is DeMarco Jackson, who probably was your second best linebacker over the full season. I mean, the linebacker spot is definitely up in question too. If you want to make a big splash and you look at what a template could be for Chicago if they want to flip this unit to be in the top 15 unit, you could look at them adding somebody in the draft in terms of being aggressive and moving up like Houston did to get Will Allen a couple years ago, and moving up to get either Arville Reese out of Ohio State or Sonny Styles out of Ohio State if you're Chicago. Both of those guys are day one impact players for the Dennis Allen defense, and somebody that you definitely need to put in your front 7 that you can consider as a policeman to be able to kind of be a dominant core piece on a defensive unit that lacks core blue chip players. So for me, if you're trying to get aggressive this offseason, I'm not necessarily looking at them from this cap space. I'm looking at it more from the infrastructure of who we keeping, who could we move, and who could we trade. A lot of people want Max Crosby. You're hearing Trey Henderson. You're hearing Khalil Mack. A lot of the common names that you're going to hear in free agency when you're talking about paid men to hire. I don't necessarily think any of them are going to be best suited to keep the Bears in a good space to be able to navigate and have the flexibility of keeping a good team every year, because this division ain't no joke. So for me, the smart move would be to try to use your assets to move up in the draft and acquire one of the elite front 7 players in the top 10 of this draft. Sonny Styles out of Ohio State again, Arville Reese out of Ohio State, and even David Bailey out of Texas Tech. Any of those 3 of your front 7 is going to be an improvement, and then you start bolstering that front 7 with players that's going to make a difference. You saw what Seattle did. You have some flexibility of adding more tools and traits to your front 7, you should do it. Tight ends last year with the receivers was probably your most excellent group over the first, let's say, half of the year, and then as it matured, they ended up being your best playmakers to kind of galvanize the top 10 offense. Cole Kmet was an absolute pro. Colston Loveland is a budding star. Durden Smythe played so much on the field, shit, you didn't realize that the Bears didn't play 3 tight ends. You know what I'm saying? So from that standpoint, they're locked and loaded. A lot of comments have been about could Cole Kmet be shot for some type of draft capital this offseason. I wouldn't put it past Ryan Poles if he wanted to make a tough decision, considering the fact that Colston Loveland is going to be the featured guy moving forward. And you could legitimately find another guy that can play the Cole Kmet role, maybe not at that level, or maybe not with that consistency, but If you're talking about keeping the books clean again and keeping the roster balanced, it might be a situation. Cole Kmet have played his last game as a Bear, being the longest tenured Bear on the team. Wide receivers. First and foremost, you got to talk about number 2, DJ Moore. Probably made 2 of the best catches in the last 10 years of Chicago Bear in relevant football. So from that standpoint, all the offseason talk is about, will he be shot? Will he be moved? He's not within this current window. Even though the Bears had success in terms of winning the division, they were 2-4 doing so. So from that standpoint, he's not an untouchable. And his tag number is comfortable to be traded to a lot of different teams. Thing is you want to get the right move or the right resources or the right value for him. When they acquired DJ Moore from Carolina, they got him in the same deal that they ended up acquiring Caleb Williams in. So I think that he's part of their plans. So it will probably take a really solid deal or something that's going to really make sense for them right now, for them to move off of him. They do seem to have the wide receiving core that they need, though, moving forward, with Ja'Day Walker coming up big in the end of the season. Zaccheaus, even though he had somewhat of a drop issue in the middle of the year, he showed to be reliable in terms of a route running. Odunze, I still have questions in terms of, can he be a top 10 receiver, but traits are still there, and it's just his 3rd year. He was hampered with injury last year, so I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. But that is a guy that I got a big eye on this season at 15. Luther Burden is the real deal, worthy of the tight end, the tight draft move capital decision that they did last year, which Ben Johnson pretty much put his foot on the table and said, let me go get this kid because he's a budding star. So if you got 2 receivers that you can pretty much book in, I guess that's why you're kind of being able to negotiate at the table with DJ Moore to see if you want to be able to move that asset for something that's going to be a little bit better for your roster overall. Looking at the defensive backs, this is probably going to be the biggest change on the season. Last year, going into the year, we said this was the strength of the team. When you look at for them having a lockdown slot corner in Kyler Gordon, having a number 1 outside corner in Jalen Johnson, and then also having 2 legitimate safeties in Jaquan Brisker and Kevin Byard, the Bears defensive back said that, you know what, this is the core of the team, and we're going to build this unit around it. Now, the first half of the year, they definitely played up to that billing. Did lose Jalen Johnson for a big chunk of that. Did lose Kyler Gordon for a big chunk of that. Tyreek Stevenson lost quite a bit of games, but you did get improvement and stepped up performances from Nashawn Wright, who played at a Pro Bowl level this year. So you have to give hats off to Al Harris and his job and be able to manipulate those secondary and utilizing all the assets and resources that they had. It's a couple of names that's not on this list in terms of Terrell Smith as well as Zah Frazier, 2 guys. There are bigger corners that are kind of like the archetypes of Tyreek Stevenson and Nashawn Wright in between. They're pretty much going to kind of push out maybe 1 or 2 of these guys that you see on the board right now. As of right now today, Bears don't have no safeties on contract. So from that standpoint, we don't know what the secondary is going to look like. If they choose to go young, the combine seem to be very loaded at safety, and we'll touch on that in a second. But at the same token, if you want them to spend bread in free agency, this is not really the offseason to be trying to overspend for safety in free agency, because there's not any names that's worthy of doing so. So after that, let's get into the next point of reference, man, and kind of get back on point. Again, I am Shy from the South Side. This is the first episode of the books where I'm kind of going into, a point of view perspective for 5 different points based on where we at in this offseason. So after we just discussed who to cut, who to trade, and all the rumors and such around the Bears, the next point of reference for me is the combine. Takeaways is about 80 to 100 players that's worthy of being NFL caliber. That's tier 2 to tier 5, meaning you could be a starter, a number 2 guy, number 3, a rotational piece, or a situational player. I think it's a bunch of them. They're loaded at running back. I see a lot of safeties, specifically box safeties, more than free safeties, defensive linemen, and specifically on the interior. Very versatile, a lot of different bodies, a lot of different skill types, whether you're in a 3-4 or 4-3, a lot of different guys that can be disruptive and can play for you or a rotation on your team. A lot of guys at the outside, meaning the edge, that not necessarily have the traits that you normally see, but guys that have some unique traits that you could see translate to the league. So I consider those guys to be like specialists, third down guys, hybrid type of players that you're going to see integrated into the defenses next year to kind of mimic what Seattle did with Emmanuel, and kind of guys that you can kind of roam around and utilize how you at your discretion. Dennis Allen had some success in terms of bringing a lot of slot pressure last year, So these are the type of guys that I'm talking about that you can kind of line up on either side and try to bring some heat. Wide receiver looks solid as well. Specifically, if you're looking for more like number twos or slot guys, very good receiving core for that. Ran really fast at the combine. Was really impressed with that. There's several high ceiling guys, man. Defensive wise, I think it's about 7 guys that can really make day one change teams in terms of not necessarily being immediate stars, but really having impacts on defenses if put in the right situation and the right coaching. The best player in my eyes has not changed, and the numbers board out. Jeremiah Love. Whatever team gets him is going to be getting another type of Saquon Barkley type running back, a Bijan Robin type. Like, seriously, a guy that's going to be able to be all-purpose and do everything for you. In a perfect world, the Bears would love to go up and move up in the draft and get him. I would trade my Guy Swift and my first-round pick to go up and get him. Yes, I would. He is Jahmyr Gibbs reincarnated in terms of being that type of explosive guy, getting the ball and can get you 80, 90 yards the time he touches it. So I think that's worth it in the draft that isn't necessarily loaded at quarterback, pass rusher, or a receiver or cornerback for that matter. Speaking of that, we talked about cornerback. Tag day means free agency starts, and honestly, free agency for me means Brisker, Nahshon, Bayard. What are you doing with your secondary? If you don't bring any of them back, that means you're resetting the whole thing, and this would be a great draft to reset your secondary because a lot of safeties, like we talked about, that you could see and let Al Harris kind of mold that unit on the young side. However, for me, I think you got to really look at your internal evaluations and how valuable Nahshon Wright was. Does he warrant you bringing him back as opposed to having to worry about cornerback next year? Because honestly, if you look at Kyler Gordon, let's just say in a nutshell, he doesn't repeat of missing this many games again, double-digit games, and you have him for the bulk part of next year, then who's your number 2 corner? I think in this particular scheme, he would be a very good player for you at about $12 million a year. I do think that them having some interest in Taylor for the Saints also makes the number have to come down for Chicago because they can do that. But I think, do you want to set that precedence? And if you're Ryan Poles, do you want to find yourself looking cheap for a player that outperformed his contract last year? Out of the 3 guys that are free agents, out of Brisker, out of Nahshon Wright, and out of Bayard, honestly, if you asking me, I probably will be looking to keep Nahshon Wright out of all 3 of them. As much as I like Brisker, you look at him from his standpoint, he did play well at the end of the year. The Green Bay game probably was his best game as a Bear, in my opinion. But do you think that a 33-year-old defensive back and Kevin Bayard can continue his upward play, even though he is a very great leader? Do you feel that you got enough leadership in the locker room and a good enough coach to kind of extend that, and that's not necessarily valuable enough to have to pay him $12 million? Do you look at Jaquan Brisker having enough development and maybe another level of maturity at 27 to give him an extension for 3 years? I don't know. I saw Adrian Amos leave and go to Green Bay and have a great extension to his career. We might be looking at a similar situation, not necessarily Jaquan going to Green Bay, but being a scenario where he moves on to a different pasture to have a better part of his career at a different seat in a different scene. If that's the case, then so be it. But out of the guys in-house, I'm looking at Nahshon that I would spend the most money or invest that money in long-term based on age and performance from last year. The next point, and probably the last point of reference for this particular episode as we hit to the 19-minute mark, and once again, this is the books, episode 1. We touching on the offseason for the combine and pre-free agency situation for the Chicago Bears. The elephant in the room is we got a center situation, man. Drew Dalman decided on the first day the teams can tag their players to announce that he's going to retire. Now, I believe internally the Chicago Bears probably know already, and more than likely based on all of the reports they did know, they probably knew before they went to the combine, meaning that if they did their due diligence, Dan Bouchard, who's the offensive line coach for the Chicago Bears, went down there with Ryan Poles and set them aboard and said, hey, if we do have to go through the draft, I feel comfortable with the fact that we got in-house Newman, we got McFadden, and we got Bates that we can kind of try out in the OTAs to figure out if any of those guys could potentially be a scheme fit and be stout enough to actually be legitimate. And if they are, then they can put them in comp with whoever they want to draft. And based on their board, to me, it looks like you can get a center in the third or fourth round. They could grade out to be a starter in the NFL. And that's just based on what you're seeing. If that's the case, then, you ain't missing nothing in Drew Dalman. Even though he was at a Pro Bowl level, you got to look at the last time I saw Drew Dalman on the field, pulling 4 beat his face in. And from that standpoint, that lets you know that it not only was a solid investment, but it's a reason why he was moved on from Atlanta. He has limitations in terms of the point of contact or at the point of attack. And if you being a center at 27 years old, he decided he didn't want to do that no more, so be it. But at Chicago Bears, you have to take on business and handle it as such. Maybe you want to go get a guy that's a little bit more stout at your center spot so you can have a better anchor. That means that Lindenbaum may not be the best investment, meaning spending $18 million on the best center on the board. If you think that the Ravens are letting him go for no reason, I think you just got to think about, are you going to invest at the center position that much based on who you have at quarterback? To me, I don't think it's necessary for you to spend that much at the center spot, especially if you feel that Dan Bouchard is a solid enough coach. And if he can coach up a backup, then I think if you give him a true center that's played the position in college for over 25 games, then you give him an opportunity to mold a guy to fill in the blanks between two All-Pros and Jonah Jackson and Joe Thuney to make it an easier situation to kind of make that transition. And then you can invest your resources into left tackle, which is what I would prefer them to do. With that being the case, man, at 21 minutes, I want to say I appreciate you joining me for episode 1. I hope you got a little bit out of this episode here in terms of the Bears moving into the next day or moving into the next week of important detailed information, which is free agency, which begins on March the 11th. I'll probably tune in on that week just to kind of see where the Bears have put their minds to. If I believe what's the case to be a couple of trades for the Chicago Bears sooner rather than later. So if we look at what history says, Ryan Poles might be waiting to the draft to pull a move. But with this Drew Dalman situation and the books moving a little bit, they might get a little thirsty and be ready to pull some right on the first day of free agency. And if that's the case, we'll be back online with episode 2 of NFL offseason Chicago Bears free agency, okay? Once again, you can see me on CNG Podcast online. Got to be YouTube and as well as on TikTok. You can catch me on The Podcast. The podcast from the South Side is also a TikTok establishment as well as on YouTube. Once again, this is Shad from the South Side. I appreciate you rocking with me. Enjoy the day, y'all. Peace.